Hi, folks, and welcome back. So this week in class, we're reading a paper by a philosopher named Brianna Toole. Toole is a young philosopher at Claremont McKenna College in California, and she's doing some interesting work at the intersection of epistemology, philosophy of race, and feminism. And we are looking at a paper this week, a paper of hers this week called From Standpoint Epistemology to Epistemic Oppression. I really like this paper because she does a very nice job of encapsulating the central ideas of standpoint epistemology and relating them to some of the themes that we're developing in the course. So we've been talking about oppression, we've been talking about epistemic injustice. We're trying to understand how our social structures and social institutions affect our knowledge practices, and that's precisely what Toole is writing about here. So she's not the originator of these ideas in standpoint epistemology. They go back in the feminist literature at least until the 1970s, but she is putting them in a context that is really useful to us, which is why we're turning to her paper this week. So let's take a second to take stock of where we are. Right? We've upended the Cartesian view, the traditional Cartesian view of epistemology in favor of what I'm calling social epistemology. That is, we have rejected the idea that epistemology is solely concerned with responding to skepticism. We're not simply trying to give a vindication of our knowledge, nor are we trying to argue the skeptical position and say that knowledge is impossible. We're also not simply trying to give the necessary and sufficient conditions for saying that some claim is an instance of knowledge, for claiming that someone knows something is the case. Instead, we are trying to understand our epistemic practices, our practices, social practices of knowledge discovery or generation, and of sharing knowledge claims and of putting those knowledge claims to use. So we're looking at the norms that govern our social practices of knowledge production. Right? That's what we're doing from this perspective of social epistemology. But even within this view, there are some remnants of the traditional view. In particular, this view, as well as the traditional view, tends to prioritize exclusively epistemic features, as Toole calls them. We tend to prioritize notions like reliability, evidence, and truth in our epistemology. We understand knowledge as justified true belief, and we tend to think that justification is a matter of being a reliable reporter, being able to identify the thing that's in front of your face and reliably give a report of what you see or what you experience, and of having good evidence or being able to produce good evidence for the claims that you make. We tend to think, though, that in principle, anyone can come to be in a position to know that P, to know that something is the case. If P is something that can possibly be known, then anyone could be in a position to know it. That doesn't mean that everyone will. That doesn't mean that everyone will know what is the case, or that everyone is in a perfect position to know what is the case. But anyone could, in principle, come to be in a position to know what is the case. Right? There's a lot I don't know about fundamental physics, but if I studied long enough and hard enough, I could put myself in the position to know something about what is the case with respect to fundamental physics. Right? That's the general idea here. So there's nothing peculiar or particular about individuals. Anyone could be interchanged with anyone else, and given the right training, given the right circumstances, could come to know what anyone else knows. Right? And moreover, objectivity is taken as an ideal. Right? The aim is to correctly represent what's out there. We want our knowledge claims, the propositions that we hold to be true, to be a correct representation of what is out there in the world. To achieve this, we have to abstract away from everything that makes an individual perspective distinctive. Right? So we need to be able to abstract away from what makes my individual perspective on the world distinctive. I can't take it to be the case that the way I see things are necessarily the way they are. But we also have to be able to abstract away from what the human perspective how the human perspective makes the world appear to us. So, for example, the way I see something and the way someone standing 50 yards closer to that thing sees it may be very different, and the truth may be somewhere in between, right? The truth may be that this thing that appears very small to me and appears very large to them is in fact a medium-sized thing that we're both looking at, but our perspective affects that. We need to be able to abstract away from those perspectives to know what the thing in the world is actually like. But our human perspective, our sensory apparatus, the sensory apparatus that we were gifted with, affects how the world appears to us as well. Right? We know from our scientific endeavors that the world is the fundamental stuff that makes up the world is not simply air and water and earth and rocks and ceramics, right? It's not these things that we can see and touch and feel. Tables aren't part of the fundamental furniture of the universe, as we might say. But in fact, atoms and subatomic particles and perhaps even small vibrating strings, energy strings, are what is fundamentally real. We can't see those things from our perspective, but abstracting away from our individual perspective and using advanced technologies and advanced instruments, we can come to see that. And the goal, if this is the way we understand our epistemology, the goal is to achieve a view from nowhere. Right? We want to know what the world is like, absent all of the things that distort our view of the world. We want to know what the world would be like from some view that was completely, or some perspective that was completely undistorted, was not limited by our sensory apparatus, was not limited by the particular position we found ourselves in. That's the goal, if we take up this sort of traditional epistemology. But there might be some reason for rejecting this traditional view. There might be some reason for saying that where you're standing has an effect on what you can know. The perspective that you're in has an effect on what it's possible for you to know. That there really is no view from nowhere, that it is an impossibility. So take this example, right? There's a classic story, a classic tale about a bunch of scientists who are each blindfolded and allowed to examine an object that is in front of them. And one of the blindfolded scientists says, it's a wall, it's a big flat surface. Another says, it's a spear, it's sharp and pointy. Another says, it's a snake, it's long and writhing. Another says, it's a rope, it's skinny and can support weight. Another says, it's a fan, it flaps around and blows wind at me. Another says, it's a tree trunk, it's solid and doesn't move. But each of these scientists is touching a different part of the same entity, this elephant, right? They can't know that from their individual perspectives. Each of them is limited in what they can feel, and none of them can see the whole thing. So their individual perspectives lead them to very different conclusions. Now, the traditional view would say something about this case. They'd say that they're all talking about the same thing, the same object that's out there in reality. And the goal of inquiry is to achieve a view from nowhere, the view that we as observers of this farce have of their investigation, right? We stand back with no blindfold on. That's an objective perspective. All of their subjective perspectives are quite limited, but our objective perspective on what is happening is not. We know that they're all being foolish and just touching different parts of an elephant. Right? That's what the traditional view would say. And maybe that's right with regard to blindfolded people touching an elephant. But standpoint theory points out that many of our objects of knowledge, many of the things that we want to know about or claim to know about, are much more complex than just an elephant standing in a field. They are products of our human practices. We want to know what our social structures are like. What are the norms of our society? How do the social structures and institutions of our society affect the people who live in that society? Do they treat everyone fairly, or do they oppress some groups and privilege other groups? How are our economies structured? Do they fairly distribute resources that are produced through those economies? Right? And here, it may be the case that there is no completely objective perspective to take. There's no way to completely abstract away from our individual positions within these social structures, within these economies. Moreover, there are other ways to be blinded besides the physical. We can be blinded by our biases and by our socialization, right? We can come to, we can, what we can understand about the world can be affected by biases that we have in the way that we encounter that world, biases we have about other people, biases we have about what the world is probably like or how we think the world is probably like. And we're socialized into these biases as we grow up in a society. Right? We're taught the world is a particular way, and we have trouble seeing it in other ways. We're blocked from seeing it in other ways. We're blocked from seeing it from other perspectives. And so we get sort of blinkered in to one view of the world, and we can't abstract away from that, or we have a very difficult time abstracting away from that. And we can't know from our individual perspective, with our blinders on, whether we're seeing the world as it actually is, whether we're seeing the true social reality, or whether the way we see the world is just our own subjective perspective on it and not what it's really like. If that's the case, if it's possible that we're blinkered in this way, that we're blinded from seeing what the world is like, blinded from taking other perspectives, then the standpoint theorist says we need to attend to those different perspectives. We need to talk to people who have those different perspectives. We need to listen to people who have those different perspectives. And we need to recognize that the claims they make, though they might not ring true to us initially, because they're from such different perspectives, may in fact give us a much better understanding of what our social reality is like. It's fundamentally what the standpoint theorist is saying. All right, I'm going to take a break here, and I'll pick up in the next video.